All right, let's get started with Advanced MS Excel. So for those of you who have joined us in the previous lessons, you've already been sent these links, but if this is your first class, that's perfectly okay. There's no prerequisites for this class. So the previous lessons are listed here and will be sent in the follow-up email you receive. So what does advanced mean? Advanced could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For the purpose of this class, we're not going to get too crazy. Don't worry, you're in the right class. It's what an employer could reasonably expect for someone saying that they know how to use Excel. Many employers will request that people have Excel knowledge going into a job. Well, what does that mean? If they require extremely specific financial information, they would ask for that. But if they say knowledge of Excel, today's class will be above and beyond what most people would self-teach. Most of us are self-taught in Excel, and this would be that kind of that next step. So before we get going, we've got a new thing to try in these classes. This is the first time we've done it. We're going to ask a quick polling question. So I'm going to ask Glory to put that polling question up on the screen. And we're simply asking, have you ever applied for a job that specifically requires Excel experience? Just a yes or no answer. Won't be sharing your information with anyone else, but if you want to just quickly answer that, if it came up on your screen. If you're on a phone, it'll say, will you authorize this polling question? All right. While you're doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we'll be going over today. So we'll be talking about ranges, specifically named ranges, and kind of how they work within Excel formulas. Formulas and functions are often described differently. Functions are within formulas. I generally think of anything that has a name as a function, but technically the function is only the named part of that formula, and that'll make sense as we go along. But for the purpose of this class, we'll talk about functions and we'll talk about formulas. And then we can also talk about formulas within functions because they're not, it's not one or the other, they can be both. And then we'll work with tables, something called slicers, and pivot tables. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be going back and forth between a PowerPoint presentation and a live Excel demonstration. To help you with the follow-up material, I'll be sending the file that I'm working with. It's an example file that has examples of all the formulas and functions and ranges and tables and pivots that we talk about today. And the reason for this is when you get it, you can play around with it. It'll make a lot more sense when you can actually interact with the numbers. So first off, let's define what is a range. This is pretty basic information, but it's absolutely essential to everything else we do. When we make a reference to a cell is just a combination of a column and a row. So this would be B1 right here. When we want to reference more than one cell at a time, we do it as something called a range. So in this example, this range would be denoted as B3 through E9. So use the top left and the bottom right cells with a colon in between to denote a range. And you always have parentheses around it. Now, if this were simply within a column, there's technically no top left and bottom right, but just think of it as top and bottom. And if it were across, it would be left and right. So this would be B3 through E3, and this would be B3 through B9. Now, there are times when it's beneficial to give that range a name. The reason for this is ranges, named ranges, are more portable. They can work throughout a workbook very easily. They're also static to a certain extent, meaning that wherever you drag them, they will stay the same. But they're dynamic in a sense that you can add information to them without having to redefine what the range is. So to do that, to name a range is really simple. You, just as before, you select the information that you want to include in that range, and then you go up to the name box on the left-hand side here, and you type in the name of the range. So in this case, I'm going to call it example. And as long as you have this exactly highlighted, it will say example up there, which is great. But when you first start working with named ranges, you forget what you selected. And unless you select exactly that range, it's not going to show you what it is. So another thing that's really nice to know is where to find all of your ranges throughout your workbook. And we do that by clicking on, this is, by the way, what it would look like if you're going to make a reference to it. Just like the previous reference, you put it in parentheses, and then you name it something. Don't put any spaces in between. If you're going to put spaces, put an underscore instead between two words. And then we go to the formulas bar on the tab, on the ribbon, the formulas tab on the ribbon, and we go to named ranges. The name manager is where we would find all of our named ranges, which is really nice. It'll list all of them you have within your workbook. In this particular workbook, I have one. It's called example. The two quotations, I know that's really small. That means a blank cell, and this is what it refers to. In the previous lesson, I talked about the syntax or the way you would denote a sheet reference. So this is sheet 1, B3 through E9. And there's absolute references to those cells. And that will become more apparent as we go. And the scope is where it is. It's in the entire workbook. So you can go to that anytime you want. You can delete ranges from here very easily. You just click on them and then hit delete. So very nice to work with. All right, so now that we have an idea of what ranges are, we're going to talk about the simplest function we can use with those ranges. I call them range functions. That might be the technical term, it might not, but it just means that the only argument for the function is the range it pertains to. Now that sounds really fancy, but all it means is if I were to want to add up everything in this row, so for May I want to add up all these numbers, I would start it just like I would a formula. I would type the equal sign in. I would type the name of the function and the range it pertains to. So this is the most common function used in Excel. It's called the sum function. Equals sum, left parenthesis, B3 through B9. Now, if that were a named range, I would have had to have named it previously, and then I could type in the name of the range, and that would have worked also. You don't guess at functions. You either know them or you don't. So there's nothing in your previous math experience that will prepare you for functions. They're all given a specific name, and they're all given a specific way of formatting them. The range functions are the easiest, and that's why I've included them here. Now, once I hit enter on this, I will get the answer. Here's a little tip for you. If you've ever hit enter on something and then needed to drag that same cell over, you find out that once you hit enter, it goes down to the cell below it. If you hit control enter instead, it will make that calculation and stay in the same cell. That seems real simplistic, but honestly, I wish I had known that 10 years ago. Once you do that, you use the fill handle right here. And when you're on the fill handle, your pointer will become a black cross. And then you click and drag it across to wherever you want it to go. That's why we name the cells in a range, because if we had used a formula to do this, equals 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6, we wouldn't have been able to drag it over. Also, if we'd used a formula, we would have, even with cell references, we would have had to have said equals B3 plus B4 plus B5 plus B6. This simple formula, this function sum here, will work with one cell. You can actually make a reference to a range of one cell, B3 through B3, all the way up to whatever you can write. It could be a million cells. You could say equals the sum of B1 through B1 million. It would actually add those up very quickly for you. Saves you a lot of time. And then you'll see at the end, because we use cell references, it is going to change those cells in the direction that we drag them. So because we went from this cell to this cell, none of the rows changed, but the columns did. I went from B, 1, 2, 3 cells over, so it went from B to E. Because I started in row 10 and I ended in row 10, the rows didn't change. Since we already defined a range and named it for the entire amount, for everything, what we could do is we could put that information into this. So the 4-month total, we could just say equals sum of example. because this is the defined name range. I could certainly still say equals sum of B3 through E9, but this is just one example of where you would use a named range. Any questions on ranges or cell references before we continue?
Yes, Art, we have some pretty good questions coming in. So the first one I'm going to ask before we get off of this page 2 is, would you just type the example instead of the formula?
So do you mean if I would just say equals example?
Correct.
Well, it wouldn't know what to do with that.
Okay.
So you'd have to say, what do I want to do with example? Yeah.
Okay, and I believe that's the way the question is being phrased. If it's not, Shelley, would you clarify a little bit in the chat? They also want to know, what did you say about using control with sum?
I'm so glad you're paying attention there, because I thought that was really cool. So here's an example. If I were to say, here's 1, or here's 2, and here's 4, and I wanted to add those two up, equal sum of this through this. If I hit enter, it makes the calculation and it goes down one row. Okay. If instead I did this and I hit control enter, meaning I held the control key down and hit enter, it makes that calculation, finalizes it, but stays in the same cell. And the reason this is handy is because in most cases, we're going to drag that formula across to other items. And it saves a second, it saves a click, but you know, it saves a little time. So no big deal, but it's a nice little trick.
Shelley did clear up that question too. She said, type an example, please, to sum the total of the column instead of the formula.
Okay, sure. All right. Well, this is going to be an example of why this is so beneficial. If I did this as a formula, this one right here, I've got it as a function right now, which is equals sum of B4 through B10. And that's the quick and easy way. If I had done it the more difficult way, I would have to say equals B4 plus B5 plus B6 plus B7 plus B8 plus B. I think you kind of get the idea here, but I'm going to continue just because I'm done. It's a lot more work to do it as a formula. Okay. Functions save us time. They're basically named formulas that work with ranges. Okay. It works the same either way, but at some point it becomes very, very obnoxious to have to type in, you know, in fact, I made a mistake there, and it opens you up to mistakes. Also, you see in this case, I made a mistake in the last one. I said plus 10. I meant to say plus B10. The longer your formulas are, the longer your functions are, the more apt they are to have mistakes. And that's okay. That happens all the time, and that's not, you know, the end of the world. We just need to fix them. But if you can find a shorter way to do it, a more efficient way to do it, one, it's going to save you the time initially of having to type it in, but two, it's going to leave you less open to syntax errors, the way you typed it in, or just silly little errors like what I just did here. I hope that answered the question.
Another one that I have too is, can Art show again how he named the range? I'm trying to do it and it is not working right.
Okay, so an example here, if I wanted to name this range, so maybe I want to name this range sum. I just select the range I want to name. I go up to the name box right up here, and I type in sum. And once I hit enter, that for now and forevermore until I change it, this range would be called sum. So I could say equals sum of sum. I guess I wouldn't recommend naming your ranges the same name as a function because it looks a little goofy, but it does work. Okay. So one more time.
Just one more question. Yes. I have quite a few people asking, are we going to be covering VLOOK or VLOOK?
Yeah, VLOOK.
Yes.
Yes, we will.
Okay.
Yep. All right, let's carry on. And by the way, I appreciate all the questions. So the next thing is basically the sheet I just shown you, the most common functions that are used within the range functions, meaning that it's the name of the function and the range it applies to, are listed here. Sum, the most common one. There's even a keyboard shortcut for sum, which is Alt plus equals. If you hold down the Alt key and then you hit the equal key, it will take an educated guess at what you want to add up, and it'll put the appropriate function in that cell. Average function, and by the way, it's spelled average. It's not AVG. I always thought it should be. It's not. You have to spell it average. Actually takes the sum of a range and divides it by the count of a range. So basically, it's taking the average of the total. Count will count the number of numbers in a given range. 0 is different than a blank. 0 is considered a number as far as Excel is concerned. A blank is not. And then max and min are exactly what they appear to be. It'll show you the maximum number in a range and the minimum number in a range. And I will be sending everyone examples of all of them with some handy little notes that will talk about what to look out for them. But if you can see here, other than this one they just changed, they're real simple. Function, argument, which is just the range. Function, argument. These are so commonly used that there's a button on the ribbon. On the Home tab on the ribbon, there's an auto sum button, and that's been there for a long time, meaning that if I wanted to, let's say, just delete this out, and I said I want to add this up, I can just put my insertion point there, or my cell indicator box there, and click on auto sum. That's towards the right end of the Home tab, and it will take a guess at what I want to add up. Now, where this can become a little tricky is if you're at the juncture of two, a row and a column. Don't always assume it's going to choose the right thing. In fact, in this case, there's a blank here that messed things up. So I don't want to just add up these here. I want to add up this, including that blank. So I reselect it, and it adds it right into that entry. So those are the range functions. Like I said, I'll send everyone a cleaned up version of this file, and it'll give you examples of each. Oh, one other thing I wanted to show you on this. One of the things they've added recently is the ability to use all the other range functions. So on the auto sum button, there's a drop down, and you can go to average, count numbers, max, min. So if I clicked on average here, it would put the average, guess at what I want to average, and then I just hit enter. One other little thing to know about this, sometimes we don't want to necessarily change our spreadsheet. We just want to quickly grab some information. And if that's the case, just select the information you want. And on the status bar, and I know this is really hard to see, especially if you're looking at a phone, but on the status bar, the green bar on the bottom of your Excel document, it'll give you the average, the count, and the sum as just a quick reference. It doesn't calculate them on the spreadsheet itself. It just shows you what they add up to or average or count at. And sometimes when you just jump into a document, that's all you need. All right. So any questions about the range functions before we move on to the more, I guess, complex functions?
Yes, I do have a question. It says for average, can it change between mean, mode, and the other one?
Here's what happens with average. Average is very specific on how it works. It works with, it adds up the total sum of whatever your range is, and it divides it by the number of numbers in that range. So the only thing you need to know different about that is the note I give here. If there's a 0, it is treated differently than a blank cell. So if I put in a 0 here, I'll get a certain average, in this case 51.43. But if I delete that out completely, it takes it out of the calculation. In fact, it's not counted, so instead of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 numbers, it's only counting 6. So be very careful on that. There is some differences in how math works with the zeros. Zeros are one of the trickiest things in math. In fact, I'm going to be giving an example of how it can really mess up a spreadsheet here in a moment.
I have another question too, Art, that says I don't show the status bar at the bottom of the screen. Is it a setting?
No, it should not be. You should not be able to take off your status bar. At least I have never been able to do that. But what you'll find is it doesn't show anything until you select something. Okay. Maybe you can take it off. Hold on. No, you can customize the status bar. I've never taken it off. That would be a new one to me. Tell you what, if I can figure out how to add or subtract the status bar, I'll put it in the follow-up email. All right.
One more question real quick here, Art. They wanted to know, are you using MS Excel 2010?
Yeah, no, I'm using 2013. And I'm glad that question was brought up because everything I'm showing you works for about 2010 on up. In fact, almost everything I show you will work for every version of Excel. All the formulas, all the functions are going to work exactly the same. The named ranges, some of the things with pivot tables, and we're going to briefly touch on pivot tables, may have been advanced as we go, or you get to them differently. But everything I'm going to show today can be done and can be done fairly easily within any version of Excel. If you have 2010 or above, you're absolutely fine. And 2007 is a little bit different, and then the structure of how you get to things in 2003 and below is different, but still perfectly fine. All right, we're going to talk now about that next step, and this is a scary step for a lot of people because until you know and gain a little confidence in functions, they can be very, very scary. Okay, because it really looks like it's some advanced algebra type of thing. Remember I said that nothing prepares you for how functions are put together because they all have their own rules. In this case, we're going to do one of my favorite functions, which is the if function, to demonstrate how you work with functions. If you can understand the if function, you can understand most functions because if makes a little bit of sense. And once you kind of grasp that, okay, I just have to kind of follow the rules here, you can work with pretty much any function. And there are tools built right into Excel to help you. Above and beyond that, Excel has the biggest fan base of any program in the history of the world, as far as I know. There are forums that I've been on in Excel that have millions, literally millions of questions that have been asked and answered. There are people whose lives revolve around Excel, so there's a lot of support. So if you have any questions about any function, just go to YouTube. You'll get a lot of videos. Some are great, some are not so good, but most are fairly helpful in helping you understand. So here's the question I want to ask. I want to ask in this function, in this particular spreadsheet, does this month's total meet the quota? So I'm asking for, is this number equal to or greater than this number? And I can do that through a simple function. So what I'm going to do first here is I'm going to go to the formula bar, the formula tab on the ribbon. I could also go right here to this FX, this function, insert function, but I'd like people to get to the formula, messing around with the formula bar because there's a lot of stuff here. So on the formula bar, I click on insert function. Now, all functions can be built from scratch. You can do it yourself if you know how to use them, and eventually the ones you use enough, you will know how to use them. But when you're doing it the first few times, it's not a bad idea to click on the function builder. So we click on insert function, and it'll give you a list of all the different functions that are available through drop-down lists. They are categorized, and the categories are very similar to what's up here. There are, I think, right around 500 built-in functions within Excel. You will not use even 10% of those, probably in your entire life. They're specific to industries, to the needs of, different types of work. There are some fairly standard ones, though. And once you understand those, you can do a lot. So what I'm going to do is use the most recently used category, and I'm going to go to the if function. I'll click OK, and then it brings me to this little dialog box. That's going to help me build this function. First thing they're going to say is, what's the logical test? And all that means is, what do you want to test? What do you want to know? So the logical test is defined as the value or expression that can be evaluated as true or false. Okay, so I want to say, is this equal to or greater than this? So I use cell references to do that. So this cell is B10, so I say B10 greater or equal to B1. Now, I haven't used the greater than or less than symbol since 3rd grade. It's something that you don't use a whole lot in everyday life, but it did come back fairly quickly. So you can't say equal to or greater than, by the way. It's greater than or equal to. And the greater than symbol is above your period on your keyboard. And immediately it's going to tell me if that's true or false. And that's really good. If it says invalid or something like that, then you know you should probably start over. And then the next thing you answer is, what do you want to have happen? If that evaluates as true, what do you want to have shown, or what do you want to have calculated? And if it evaluates as false, what should show for that situation? Now, if you leave those two blank, and anything that's not bolded, you can leave blank, it'll just say true or false right here. But in this case, I wanted to say something. I want to say, great job if they meet the quota or exceed the quota, and I want it to say overtime required if they don't meet the quota. Okay, and then it will actually show you in this cell that you're in what the result will be, so you can kind of see if it's going to work or not. So I'm going to click OK, and it gives me the answer. It gives me the result of this formula right up here. And notice it built it for me. I'll walk you through that in just a minute, but it built it for me up here, and it gave me the results in the cell it was entered. Now, again, most of these formulas you're going to enter are going to be clicked and dragged across the entire columns they relate to. Now, here's a very important point with functions, and don't learn the hard way on this. You will make mistakes. Never assume just because a function works once that it works for everything. You always want to test it for a true and a false. I've tested it for a true, but now I look at this, and this should be, or excuse me, for a false. Now I want to test it for a true. Well, here it says it worked, but what about this one? 161 is not greater than or equal to 175. 151 is not greater than or equal to 175. So I'm going to go to this one, I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to see what the issue is. Can anyone tell me in the chat box what the issue is? I know that's asking you to type in a couple things, but there is an issue right here. It's a problem solving. Yeah, cell C2. Why would C1, actually it's C1, but why would C1 be part of this equation? The reason is I drug this information from here all the way across. So every cell that I referenced changed in the direction I went. So what was a reference to B1 became a reference to C1. There's nothing in C1. So obviously 161 is greater than or equal to nothing. So it said great job. So what I need to do is change that. Another word of warning, do not change it here. That's a spot fix. You do not want to spot fix formulas. A formula that is drugged somewhere should work for the entire range of cells it is placed in. So I'm going to go back to this first cell in the row, and I'm going to change B1 to an absolute reference to B1. And if anyone remembers from the course we had a couple of weeks ago, if you were here, you can either put $signs in front of both the column and the row to make an absolute reference, which means it's going to stick no matter where you drag it, or you could click within that reference and hit the function key F4, and it's going to cycle through the different types of absolute references. Once I've done that, there's still one more step, because again, that's only good for this one. Now I need to click and drag it through the whole range, and I see that it works. And I'm going to say this multiple more times. You will make mistakes with this, but that's okay. That's how you're going to learn. All right. So another case for if, and if has limitless potential. There's so much with just instituting if into your Excel knowledge base and for what you can do. Here's just one more example. The if function is really good for avoiding something called the division by zero error, because it can ruin your spreadsheet. Anytime Excel sees a zero, I mean, it can work with it certainly, but it cannot divide by it. Because if you have 8 divided by 0, that's a mathematical impossibility. So instead of saying 0, like maybe you would think or want it to do, it will say #div/0. which means that it's not a value, it can't be calculated, and it could multiply throughout your spreadsheet because that cell could be referenced in another cell, which could be referenced in another cell, and you're going to keep multiplying that error. So in the spreadsheet I am sending everyone with the examples, I give an example of one method of avoiding that division by zero error. And it looks like this. I say if the whatever cell that I anticipate maybe having a zero in it, if it equals 0, then that's how I think of that first comma, put in a 0 or whatever I want. Or maybe I would say put in, can't divide this, it's a 0. I mean, I can do whatever I want. The other comma represents the value of false. So if it's not a 0, it does the calculation as intended. Okay? So you quickly come to methods for which you can work with these formulas and functions. It's how you read them. It's kind of like helpful tips. So instead of saying, you know, logical argument, value of true, value of false, I say, if this is true, then do this. Otherwise, do this. And that's just what made sense to me. And in a lot of trainings you take online, a lot of videos you watch, you'll see people do similar things. They'll say, try to read it like this and it'll make more sense. So in the example, in the spreadsheet I'm going to send you, I've got a division by 0 error, and here's what it looks like. So I'm dividing this by this, and I get that division by 0 error. And I embedded a formula here that does exactly what I just said. If this number, B7, equals 0, then just put in a 0. Just enter a 0. Otherwise, do the calculation as intended. All right. Before we get on to some additional functions to learn from, are there any questions we need to get to, Gloria?
Yes, I think this one is a great question. What is the shortcut for relative absolute references again?
Okay, so let me just demonstrate that. It'll probably be easier. So I'm going to make this huge. I'm going to make a reference to C8 here. So if I say equals C8, I can be at the beginning of it, the middle of it, the end of it. It doesn't matter. I hit the F4 key, the function key F4. This is the top of your keyboard, and it goes through all the relative and absolute references. So the first one would be a relative, strictly relative reference, C8. The next one, which is the most common one, would make everything absolute, both the column and the row. Don't make the mistake of using this one to think it's locking in the entire cell, because it's not. This is only locking in the column. Now, for sliding fee scales or sliding references, sometimes you want that to happen, but it's really rare. In most cases, you want to do this. Even if you don't have to, lock them both in. It takes the guesswork out of it.
Thank you, Art.
Okay.
I have one other question. It says, please point out the limitations when using Google Sheets.
So I do use Google Sheets daily. I use them for a lot of things. And so let me talk about the positives first before I tell you the negatives. The positives are it's instantly networked. I mean, you don't have to be on the same internal network. It uses the internet as a network. And I'm not saying that you couldn't do that with Excel also, but it's a free resource that everyone usually has because they have a Gmail account. So I can share a spreadsheet with the world. I could create a spreadsheet right now and share it with all of you today. It'd be very easy to do. I just have to send you a link. The negatives, there's not a ton of negatives. It does work very well with the same functions, the same formulas, but again, test it out. Even more so, I wouldn't use Google Sheets professionally. I would use Excel if at all possible. But there are times, especially within academia, that people use Google Sheets. And in my experience, they work very well. One of the things that it doesn't work very well with is scope. You do not have an infinite amount of columns and rows in Google Sheets. Just today, I had to add a whole bunch of more rows, and even with shortcuts, it's a laborious process, to a sign-in sheet because it ends much sooner than an Excel spreadsheet would. And the reason is they don't want to have any more space, memory space on their server than they need to. So there are some limitations, but I will say it works fairly well. I'm amazed at what you can do with Google Sheets. I like Google Sheets in relation to Excel much more than Google Docs in relation to Word. And by that I mean that's the similar product. And you can just do if you Google Sheets versus Excel, you'll get a million different articles on the pluses and minuses of both. All right, let's talk about a few of the other functions that are very useful to gain an understanding of functions, and we will get to Vlookup at the end here. So the first one is COUNTIF. It's a expanded range function. It's a range function basically with a simple argument. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So in this case, I've got some responses here, and I've got yeses and nos. Conformity of data, or there's a better word for that, making your data the same is really important. So when you enter things like people's names and responses, make sure you're consistent, because otherwise you're going to miss some things. So this particular function, the COUNTIF function, just looks at a range, and then you tell it what you want out of that range. In a function, it's very important that when you're referencing a text instead of a cell reference, that you put things in quotations. The function builder doesn't always require you to do that. It does it for you, but even within the function builder that we were using with the if function, I put things in quotations because it's just good practice, because it has to be that way in the end on the formula bar. So how I'd read this is, count within this range for this result. If I hit enter there, it's going to say that there are 3 results. And if I change this to a yes, oops, notice I didn't type in yes correctly, it goes to 4. Now, I know that seems simple. I've used this a lot. It's really nice. I use it for, if I want to say how many times did this happen. Well, I just search for that and I count them. And I've got some spreadsheets that are several hundred items long, and if they've got a little like an asterisk next to them, I can count the number of asterisks, and I can see how many specific examples of something I have. Gloria, was there a question?
Yes, I have somebody who asked, could you show a shortcut to select all the data of a sheet, assuming that it's too large to hand select it?
Yeah, you just hit the top left icon right here, or top left, the convergence of the row and the column. There's this little thing right here. It's the select all button. You can also hit Control A, and outside of a range, and it will select the entire document. Now be aware, that's the entire spreadsheet, not the entire workbook, the entire spreadsheet. But I've just selected, I think, 17 billion cells, so that's a lot. One of the things I used to show people is, if I typed in my name here, and I hit a certain keystroke, which I'm not going to tell you, look it up yourself, it would put my name in every one of those cells. That's a quick and easy way to lock up your computer, by the way, and I don't want to do that during a live demonstration. So be aware that it's not just the screen you're looking at, it's everything. So that's the select all button, or the keyboard shortcut, which is pretty much universal across Microsoft and other products, Control plus A. And it'll select the entire document, or the entire spreadsheet. All right, so that's COUNTIF. It's pretty simple. The next one we're going to talk about is our AND and OR. Now, these have a special place. AND and OR are usually used as what we call nested functions, meaning that they're part of a bigger process. And they're very similar. In fact, they're exactly the same in how you use them. It's different in the results they will show. So what if instead of saying I wanted to test for one thing, like greater than or equal to the quota, I wanted to test for a multiple things. What I would do then is I would create a nested function within an if function. So this looks, don't worry if this looks really, really complicated right now. It'll look simple in a minute. I'm going to tell you what here. Let's just do this. Okay, so I'm going to put it on a Word document, and then I'm going to break it down for you. So every function starts the same, equals function name, left parenthesis. And then you move on. If it's another function, you don't have to put the equal sign, but you put the function in the left parenthesis. So what I'm saying is, if all of these conditions are true, that's what and means. It puts conditions separated by a comma. So I'm testing for 1, 2, 3, 4 different things. Once I put that parenthesis, that second parenthesis for the and, I go back to the if function. So basically I'm jumping into the into the and function with this parenthesis, and I'm jumping back into the if when I finish the and. So it's if these are true, then show me this. Otherwise, show me this. So let's go back to that function here. And what it's saying is, if all of these cells have a yes in them, show me yes. Otherwise, show me no. I hit enter, and you can see in this case, there's yes, yes, but there's 2 no's, so I get a no. In this case, I have all yeses, so it says yes, and in this case, they're all no's. Now, you always want to test this. So I'm going to test this by putting in anything. It actually doesn't have to be a no, it could be a J. This isn't a yes. And by the way, when you test for something, you're only testing for true. And you're only testing one thing for true. Well, in the case of and, you're testing a lot of things, but you're only testing for what you define. So if I turn this back to a yes, the answer should be yes. Now, if you understand and, or is extremely simple to understand. It just means there's only one little difference. And that little difference is only one condition needs to be met. So again, going to that Word document. In fact, all I need to really do is change and to an or. And that's what I did when I created this. It's the same exact syntax, same exact way of putting it together. And how I'd read this is, if any of these arguments are true, if D4 equals yes, or E4 equals yes, or F4, or G4 equals yes, then give me a yes. Otherwise, give me a no. So the only way I get a no in this situation is if all of them had a no in them, or something other than yes. So I look at this, and I see that there's one yes there. There's a whole bunch of yeses there. They're all no's here. Because they're all no's, I get a no. Now I'm going to test that by, again, putting a J in there. And a J is not a yes, but if I put a yes in, it turns to a yes. Okay. Any questions about that, Glory?
Yes, how do you reference a cell from another file?
That would be a workbook reference as opposed to a that would be a workbook reference as opposed to a worksheet reference. And I did cover this a little bit in the last one, but I can quickly do it for you. If you're going to, let's just put up a new, I'm going to try to put up a new document. Okay, so I've got these side by side. I've got another new workbook here, and I've got the workbook I was working with here. So if I want to reference something in this new workbook, all I have to do it the simple way, by the way, the simple way is to type in, well, here, let's do this. I'm going to type in 67. And that's in cell A1 in book 4. The one I opened is book 4. So I'm going to say equals, and then I'm just going to go over here and click on it twice. The first time I click on it, it activates that window. Second time I click on it, it puts the correct reference into the cell I'm working on. So the syntax would be equals brackets, the name of the workbook, bracket, and then the name of the sheet within that workbook, which happens to be sheet 1. Exclamation point is how you know that. And then it makes an absolute reference to the cell. So really there's 3 levels: workbook, worksheet, cell. Another question, Gloria?
One more, boy, I remember when you answered this one for me, Art, it changed my life. It's an important question. How do you do the side-by-side view?
Okay, so a couple different ways to do that. Depends on what kind of operating system you're working on. If it's a newer version of Windows, it's very, very simple to do. If it's an older version of Windows, it's much more difficult to do. But if you're going to, let's say, take this particular window, and this isn't, by the way, this has nothing to do with Excel. This is based on Windows. you could either drag it to the left-hand side if you're working with one monitor, and when you get to where your pointer is, it will snap into place. Now, I'm working on 3 monitors right now, so that doesn't work for me. I'm working on the center monitor. So the keyboard shortcut for that would be holding your Windows key down and hitting your left arrow key. Windows, which is between your Control and Alt, you hold that down and you press your left arrow key. And then you would do the same thing for this window. So if this were not split perfectly, Windows key, right arrow. And that way you get a perfect split of 2 windows on the same monitor. And yes, it is very, very helpful. I use it all the time. Okay, let's go back to, before I get too off track here, minimize a few of these windows. The next one is what many of you came for today, because I get a lot of questions on this. We're going to talk about Vlookup. Vlookup simply means vertical lookup. There is a sibling to Vlookup called HLookup, and HLookup simply means horizontal lookup. So Vlookup means, or horizontal lookup, I guess I have my directions mixed up there. So I've got a example of how this works on the spreadsheet I'm going to give you, but I'm going to walk you through it because there are a few steps to this. However, this allows you to do so many really, really nice things that it's worth figuring it out. Okay, so first off, I'm going to give you an example of why you may have some information in a spreadsheet that you don't necessarily need to print. So if I have the tax code for the United States and I want to pull out one line of information from that, I only want to print that one line of information. I don't need to print off the whole thing. So in many cases, the range we use to look up, the table that we look up information on a Vlookup, and that's the idea, you're looking up information in a table or in a range of information, doesn't necessarily have to be on the same spreadsheet. So in this case, I've got a tab called Range for Vlookup so that you can kind of trace it. And if you click on that, this is what I will actually be working with. Now, I'm going to make a point here early, and hopefully I'll repeat myself a little later on. For Vlookup to work, the base column needs to be in numeric or alphabetic order. It doesn't jump around very easily. So if I had it set up this way, I'm going to do another sort here. And I'm going to go to, hold on a second, I was within something there. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to sort it, let's say, this way. This would totally wreck this, because it would go to this first one and say, oh, that's the highest value, and it's going to stop looking through the rest of the table. So that's the limitation, and there are limitations to Vlookup. So make sure that you do a filter based on that first column so that it's numerically or alphabetically, you know, A to Z. I did list in the PowerPoint a workaround for that. For people who want to go second step advanced, you can do something called index and match. They're 2 separate functions that will overcome this issue. And if you're interested in that, all you have to do is look up how to use index match or Vlookup versus index match, and there's hundreds of articles that will step you through it, but it's a longer process than I want to go through today. But I do want to mention it simply because it's the workaround for many of the problems that Vlookup has. All right, has problems, but it's still awesome. So when you define this information, not a bad idea to make a named range, and that's what I did. I selected just the data. I did not select the headers because that would mess things up. So even though I want them there for my purposes, Excel doesn't need to know about them. So I selected them and I named this tax underscore rate. So keep that in mind. That's the named range, tax underscore rate. Now I'm going to go back to the Vlookup example. And how you build a Vlookup is like any other function. The first time you do it, you're going to want to do a function builder. So I can either go to formulas and insert function, or I could go to insert function here. So because I use this one a lot, it's one of my most recently used. I'm going to click up on Vlookup and click OK. And by the way, you will get a definition of what functions will do if you click on them. However, I find them not to be too definitive for my purposes. If you're new to it, it is kind of confusing to read how they describe it. So I'm going to click on Vlookup. I'll click OK. And the first thing it asks for is, what do you want to look up? So this is the information which I'm going to type in. Like maybe I'm looking for someone's name, or I'm looking for, in this case, their client ID. So all I do is I put the reference to that cell where that information will be. So I'm going to put in that cell, okay? So F5 is what I'm going to look up. And that's kind of confusing the first time you do it because I haven't even entered that in yet. The next thing is the table array. This is the table of text, numbers, or logical values in which the data will be retrieved, meaning that it's this table. Now, I put a reference to it here. However, it exists on that other tab. So I think I called that tax underscore, I wrote it down just in case, rate. Okay, so that's the name of the range, the named range. That's where it's going to look it up. Now, the next one kind of goes against some of the previous things I've said in previous classes. I like to say within a formula, don't put a number. Always use a cell reference. Well, in this case, we can't because it's asking for a number. And again, this is very confusing until it's explained. Column index number is the column number in the table or array from which the matching value should be returned. The first column of values in a table is 1, meaning that if I'm looking up this number in this table, so when it finds that number, what do I want to return? So in this case, I want to find the tax rate. So I want to return the first column, second column, third column, fourth column. In this case, it would be fifth column. So I'm going to say 5. And then the range lookup, because it's dimmed, I don't need to deal with that because it's not needed at this point. It's something that would be very specific to a situation. And notice it does give me the formula result. So it gives me the result of 0.07. Well, 0.07 is 7%. That's a decimal equivalent. So I would have to format that result as a percentage. So I gave examples of doing this 3 different times. And you can see in each of these, it's the same exact formula. I do use an absolute reference to this, so what I'm going to look up. And the reason I did that is so I can copy and paste it into these additional ones. You shouldn't use absolute references all the time. In fact, that's a mistake some people make. They think they have to use them for everything. That'll kind of lock up your sheet and will make it useless. But use them when you need to, and they can be very beneficial. So how this reads is, I want to look up this number in this table and return a result in this column. So this is what I look up, this is where I look it up, and this is the column from which I return the information. And again, you want to practice this. Now, this particular one wouldn't work because it's not A to Z. It's not set up correctly. So I, again, would have to sort that A to Z. And Excel is very forgiving. It basically keeps everything in the line it should be in. However, not a bad idea to make sure it does that before you move on. I always like to say, okay, 98732 was in Faribault. Okay, if I filter this and 9734 or whatever is not in Faribault, then I messed up my table somehow. And then I'm going to undo that very quickly so that I don't lose that, what I call cohesion of records, fields within records. So bringing that back one more time, I'm going to do it in the smallest to largest, which is what it has to be sorted as for VLOOKUP to work. Questions about VLOOKUP? Or anything I've covered so far?
I guess one of the questions that they were asking is, if you are in a cell and you want to exit out of the cell, is there a shortcut?
So if you're in a cell and you want to get out of a cell, there's a lot of different ways to do that. You could tab out of it, you could hit enter, you could click out. There's all sorts of things you can do. But I will tell you that different things give you different results, and sometimes they're very frustrating. So in this example, if I were in this formula and I'm thinking, I'm done with this, and now I'm just going to get out, and I click over here, sometimes that works. Sometimes what it does is, well, it's working every time for me now. Sometimes what it'll do is it'll insert whatever cell I click on into that formula. Notice I did it right there because I was on a cell when I clicked. So in that case, when you're in a formula or a function, you're typing it in and you want to get out of it, hitting enter is the easiest way to get out of it, or hitting the tab key. Now, strictly for data entry purposes, tab and enter should be used in conjunction in a specific way. So if I'm entering information across, I'm going to use the tab key, because as I enter, it goes to the next cell. But when as I hit the tab key, but when I hit the enter key, it remembers where I started tabbing from and goes back to that base column one row down. So if it makes sense to do that, it's much simpler than going to your mouse and clicking on the new cell. Because what I see a lot of people doing is they enter things vertically, and then they have to go to the top of the next column, and they take their mouse pointer and they click up here. It doesn't always make sense to do it this way, but if it does, use tab and enter in conjunction, and it'll make it easier to type in records across Excel.
Great.
All right.
Oh, somebody's there. It's kind of neat, Art, because they're answering each other's questions too as we're going along here. How about, could you explain freeze panes versus repeating headings on a page?
Sure. We'll do that one, and then we'll move on to a couple more functions. They do very similar things in different arenas. Freeze panes is for viewing purposes. Repeating headers at the top of a page would be for printing purposes. So an example would be, I'm going to bring up another sheet here, and let's say I had name and art. I'll be very boring here, and I'll go. So I went down several hundred cells there, and if I were to print this, it's going to give me that header of name on the first page, and then when I go to the next page, I'm going to lose that header. So in order to repeat that header at the beginning of every printed page, what I would do is I would go to my Page Layout tab. I click on the Page Setup dialog box launcher, which is right at the bottom right of the Page Setup grouping. I would go to the Sheet tab. And again, you can watch this through the video for all these steps. And then I would just say $1:1, $1, because it's not asking me for a cell reference, it's asking me for the row. So I only need the row portion of that. And I lock it in with an absolute reference. You just have to, that's the way it's formatted. And what that says is at the top of every page, do row 1 through row 1. Now, I know that seems silly, but sometimes we want to do multiple rows at the top of every page, so it would be row 1 through row 5. What this does for us is when I print it, name is at the top of the first page, and then when I go to the second page, third page, fourth page, even though it's the same information, I get name at the top of every page, which is very handy for printing. The other question is, how do I freeze panes? That's even a simpler process. All I need to do is click on the cell or below the cell, below the row I want to freeze, and then if I can get rid of this, something in my way here. Well, here, I'll just drag this down. There we go. I would go to View, and I would click on Freeze Panes. And there's several options here. Freeze Panes will freeze above and to the left of wherever your insertion point is, wherever you're selected. Freeze Top Row just freezes the top row. Freeze First Column just does that. But there are times when you want to freeze maybe the left column and the top row, so you'd click on cell B2. But in this case, I just want to freeze the name, so I click on Freeze Panes here, and then I can scroll through this, and you notice row 1 is locked in. Okay. Gloria, you came back on. Is there one more question before we move on?
Yes, there is, and it's on the Vlookup, so I'd like to ask it before we move on. What happens when you Vlookup for a full column and the formula doesn't compute? Even though it's correct, it comes out as 0. How do you fix? I know you have to enter, or excuse me, I know you have to click enter.
So you're getting a result that is not what you intended, just getting a 0. Okay?
Correct. Correct.
It might be that your range is not alphabetized or numerically set up. So what I do is I always make sure I test it for the first column. That way you know whether it's in the, if it's in the, easy for me to say. So in this case, what I would do is I would do a search for this particular one. So I do it with the top one. That way, no matter how it's organized, it's still going to work because it's going to look at that first one. And if you can't get it to work, if you can't get it to return whatever column within that first row, then there's something else going on. But that's the first thing I would try. Without seeing the specific spreadsheet, I can't really delve any deeper than that, but that's a troubleshooting tactic that will really help you to figure out where the problem lies, if it lies in the table or if it lies in the formula itself. All right, we're going to talk about briefly, we're not going to fully go through these two functions, but they're fun functions and they're useful for everybody who's ever taken out a loan or would like to in the future. In every Excel class I've ever taught at this level, I show these two functions. And the reason is they make sense personally. And they really show how dramatic it is to be able to have a little bit of this knowledge. So they're called the payment and the NPER function. They both exist on the financial category of functions. I mean, you can look for them just as PMT or NPER, but if you go to the financial functions category, they're there. And what it does is it looks at loans from two different standpoints. The payment looks at loans from the payment side. Instead of a bank putting together an amortization table for you and say, here's what you're going to owe on this date and this date, and these consistent payments, what it's going to do is just calculate the whole thing for you. And why this is really nice is it can say, okay, this is the percentage I'm paying. This is the amount I'm loaning. Here's what I can affect. And I did put a little note in this, and please play around with this when I send it to you. Watch what happens to my total interest for this loan. And these, by the way, are just formulas that I added in so that you could see what the results would be. But I'm going to say, instead of paying this loan off in 30 years, I'm going to change one of the variables to 25 years. And the total interest I pay goes from $171,000 to $139,000. It's really fun, and a lot of people who want to get a high interest car loan, I show them this and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that I was going to pay twice what the car was worth in interest just because they saw me coming. So what this looks like is, like I said, you don't know. It's very specific to the formula, very specific to the function and the way it goes. So there's a lot of questions that are asked, and I really like people delving into these two because there are tricks or there are situations in which you have to have a deeper understanding of what they're asking. And for example, they say, what's the rate? You have to enter the rate of interest. For me, that would be simple, right? You say the yearly interest. That's not what they're asking. They're asking for the interest per period of the loan. So I found out after a lot of frustration that I have to take that cell reference, which is D6, and divide it by 12. Now that would be the obvious the first time through. The next one is NPER, total number of payments for the loan. Well, now you take the years to pay off, the 25, and now you multiply it by 12. And then the last thing you have to enter is the present value of the loan. Now that would seem very simple. It would be the amount you borrowed. Well, from your standpoint, that's a negative amount because you owe that amount. So you have to put it as a negative amount. So there's three things you have to know or adjustments you have to make this work. So even though it would be frustrating to do, there is a payoff for doing this. One, it's something you can actually use, the payment function. And two, it really teaches you about troubleshooting through issues with a function. So that's the payment function. The other one is the NPER function. And what the variable here is, or what the calculation here is you calculate based on what the payments would be given a certain amount. So what you change is the amount you pay, and then it'll tell you how much you have to pay off if you add this additional information. So again, if I wanted to pay off a loan quicker, I'd add more money. So I'm going to pay an extra $100 on this loan, and I go from $197,000 in interest to $162,000. So again, feel free to double click, look at what it's doing, and then jump into the function builder by clicking on that insert function. It'll jump you right into it, and then you can see where those things sit and how they're supposed to be formatted. Gloria, you jumped in there.
I did. So somebody's asking, how do I use the function if the interest is compounded continuously?
Okay, so within this, and we're not going to get too into this, there are some additional. There's future value and type. So it talks about where they go. And by the way, if it's more complicated than that, what you would do is you would say calculate an interest through Excel with compound, and it'll give you the exact formula. It might be a different function. It may be an addition you make on to, or like a formula you add on to the function. But again, without the specific information, I'm not going to be able to show you that in a live situation, but that's what I would do. All right. So that's the additional functions. And by the way, there are 500 functions. You're not going to use all of them. Another really, really good one to use is, I always say this wrong, concatenate or concatenate. It's joining text strings together. I mean, it's limitless what you can use. I like actually just looking through them. And what I'll do sometimes is I'll go to the formulas, and I'll go to insert function, and I'll go to all. And it can really be mind-blowing how many there are. And when you look at some of the descriptions for these functions, you realize that these are really no part of my world. This one is returns the probability of a trial result using a binomial distribution. That went over my head. And that's okay. I think it's really cool that that exists in the version of Excel that I have access to. You probably never use more than 20 or 30 different functions throughout your time in Excel from a standard level. If you use them enough, though, get to the point where you can type them in from memory because it'll just make your work quicker and less prone to mistakes. All right, we're going to go in now into another very commonly asked for point, which is pivot tables. Pivot tables are one of the coolest things you can do in Excel. They're not hard to do. They're very easy to do. They are a little hard to wrap your mind around sometimes because it's kind of like taking a horizontal and a vertical, and while not a perfect definition, it's like adding a depth, like X, Y, and then Z. You're looking at things from different angles, and it works amazingly well. But some of the options don't work as well as others. So before I get too far into it, let me explain how to do it. First thing is, it's easier to work with pivot tables sometimes when you convert your information into a table to start with. Okay, pivot tables are a type of table. So in this case, I've got a sample, and I've got headers on here, and I've got some sample information that I want to look at from different angles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Insert on the, I've selected it first. I'm going to go to Insert on the ribbon, and I'm just going to click on Tables. And it's going to ask me, where is the data for your table? And it pre-selects based on what I selected. And it asks me, are there headers on my table? And it pre-selects that check because it assumes there are. Everything's okay. I click OK. And think of tables kind of like a more advanced style. Like in Word, you have styles that you can do. It applies some formats here. It does a very nice looking format in the blues and the light blues, and it adds a filter to it where you can do a drop-down filter and sort by those filters. It does some pretty cool things with one click of the mouse. So that's tables. You can convert a table to a range because not everything works within a table. There are times when you want to do something to this data and tables actually messes it up. So in that case, you would go to right here, convert to range, and it would convert it to a range. And by the way, you can name the table. I've named the table. I will name the table birds here in a minute because it's all about birds. And it'll carry forward that to a named range also. So now that we got it as a table, one of the quick things you can do with this is use something called a slicer. Glory, before I get into that, while I'm drinking some water here, did you have a question?
Yes, go ahead and have a drink of water, Art. There's a lot of questions about pivoting, the pivot tables. So is there a limit to how many columns and lines you can use for your data in the pivot table?
I truthfully have never run into that. I've had some massive spreadsheets that have worked with pivot tables, thousands of items and hundreds of columns. I'm sure there is. By the way, I'm amazed the amount of information you can put into Excel, even with computers today. Doing something the most inefficient way can actually slow your computer down. And within Excel, there's some things when you have to kind of like recalculate, and it chugs along and chugs along and chugs along, and it can take minutes, sometimes hours for that to recalculate. Now, part of that is because it's massive amount of data, and part of that is because it was using the wrong tools or you used the wrong method to calculate that data. So there are some more eloquent ways of doing things, and there's some more, I guess, brute force ways of doing things. As far as pivot tables, I have never run into. It'll be a quick Google search, limit of data within a pivot table. Don't have that off the top of my head. We'll get into pivot tables here in just a minute.
Could I ask one more pivot table question? Okay. If the data exists with blank rows or dividers, other than to filter, is there an easy way to quickly remove them from the pivot table setup?
I would remove them before the pivot table personally. Blank rows really mess things up as a whole. And I don't, off the top of my head, again, I'm not sure if there's an easier way to do it before or after. I would do it before. I don't like blanks. I already showed you an example of where a blank line stopped Excel from getting the full range of what I wanted to sum. I can show you that real quickly here, I think. Maybe I can. Well, here, I'll just do a quick demonstration. So let's bring up this one here. And let's say I had some information. Okay, so this is going to be really strange, but let's go this way. Okay, so very lazily, I put some information together that has multiple rows. Or has information that has rows that I want to delete some of these. Now, there used to be a reason, in fact, this used to be a lot harder. I used to have to do this through creating a macro, which would basically program Excel to do something it couldn't do in and of itself. And there was no tool within Excel that would allow this, so you kind of had to program Excel to do it for you. But in this case, I'm just going to select the range that I want to remove the blank rows from. And it's a two-step process. First, I'm going to go to Find and Select. By the way, Find is an awesome tool within Excel because we work with so much information. It's really hard to see on the screen, so I use Find a lot. But I'm going to use something called Go to Special. And what this allows me to do is I can search for blanks. So I'm going to search for blanks, and I'm going to click OK. And what that'll do is it will pre-select all the blank rows within that selection. And then all I need to do in that second step is go to Delete Rows. And now it collapses all of those blank rows so that the data is contiguous or touching. And that'll help a lot in the data. Now, sometimes that's unavoidable. Sometimes you're going to have blank rows for whatever reason. But if they're not necessary, try really hard to get rid of them. Instead, if it's a spacing issue for just visual, you can increase the size of your rows very easily by, going in between the two rows and clicking and dragging. Blank rows can really mess things up. Okay, so once we have a table, there's a lot of methods to filter that information. We can use the pre-filters, the filters that are built in. I use them all the time. There's another thing that's more visual you could use. It's kind of fun. It's called a slicer. If you click Insert Slicer on the Tools grouping of the Design contextual menu, it'll bring up this box that says, what do you want to slice on? Now, you can choose multiple slicers. In this case, I'm going to choose Bird. And then what it'll tell you is, here are the unique values within that heading. And if I want to slice them for pileated woodpecker, I click on that, and it shows me only that information. And I could, click on palm warbler or white-crowned sparrow or whatever, and it would just kind of visually, it's a very visual way of doing filters. I will tell you, I have never actually used it. I always use the drop-down filters, but Some people would find it better. I suppose for presentations, it would be a little bit more visual. All right. So the next thing we're going to be talking about are pivot tables themselves. So pivot tables are on the design. Now that I have a table, by the way, I don't have to select the entire range. I'm already in a table, and I've named that table birds. So it knows I'm in a kind of like a named range, but in this case, I'm in a table. And all I really have to do is click on Pivot Table. It's really simple. It's on the Insert menu. Click on Pivot Table, and it asks me a couple of questions. It says, first off, what's the table or range you want to make a pivot table from? And in this case, because I'm in birds, I've named that. It's pre-set up. I could also, type in A1 through, D17, but that's a little extra work. And then the next thing it's going to ask is, where do you want to put this information? Pivot tables are a little bit like charts. They're kind of almost like an object in a way, not quite, but they exist best on their own worksheet. So I could put them on a new workbook, but I'm going to say new worksheet and click OK. And basically, that's all there is to creating a pivot table. It doesn't look like much, but that's it. That's creating a pivot table. Now, the trickier part is now what do I do with that information? And what I would do is I would take various information and move it into various places. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to bring up a live example. I think I can do it from here. Okay, so I think this will work fine. Yeah. Okay, so in this case, I didn't predefine in this particular example this as bird, but it guessed. It guessed at what I wanted to do. It pre-selected that, and it's going to go to a new worksheet. And I'm going to say OK. OK, now I'm in the pivot table. Now this is where pivot tables live, right here. So I drag information into either a filter, a column, a row, or a value. And I have to say, the more you play around with this, the more it makes sense. It's really hard for me just to show you because, I'm going to show you, but you really have to get a feel for what works best in which category. So I'm going to put my birds into the columns. I'm going to put the county, I'm going to put the count. If the count is in this case, is numerical, excuse me. So I'm going to put that into the values. And then I'm going to put the month into the column. So I'm going to remove this here. I'm going to try to get this better. I messed that up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to take the birds and I'm going to put them into the rows. I'm going to put the count into the values. And by the way, once you put something into values, it'll give you the option of what do you want to do with it. So I want to, excuse me if I can get this, can't quite get it to work. There's additional information. I can say what I want to do for that. And then I'm going to put the months into the columns. And you see that quickly it starts building this kind of report for me. And it says that, hey, in August, you saw 5 palm warblers. And in September, you saw 2 pileated woodpeckers. Now, the difference here is I need to change. I got to move that back here. Oh, sorry. Need to have that filter. Now I have that third dimension. So I've got all this information, and now I can say, show it to me just for September. Show it just for October. And it's going to kind of look at it from different views. And in the GCF information I'm going to give you, the training for the Goodwill Community Foundation's Learn Free site, they've got a very large pivot table that you can play around with and some really good instruction on here's what I want you to try to achieve these results. And you kind of have a goal then. With pivot tables, it's all about experimenting. And if you lose your pivot table like I just did, you just need to click back onto it, and then you'll get these fields to work with. So I'm going to move my month back down to my column because that's where I wanted it. And again, you just have to play around with it, see what works. Sometimes you'll do something really weird and it won't make sense at all. Like I'll put count into columns. That doesn't do me any good because I've also got count in values. So play around with it, see what works, and then move things around. And it's pretty awesome. Now, having said that, this is as simple as pivot tables get. There are enormous amounts of information. There's 2 contextual tabs that deal with pivot tables. You can do all sorts of different things. You can generate reports from this. You can change your data source. You can pull in additional data. You can do a pivot chart. I'll do the best I can with questions from where we're at here, Glory. What do we have for questions?
Yes, I was thinking this will probably be the last question, and then we want to do that last poll as well.
Oh, sure.
Somebody's wondering, is there an easy way to see if there are formulas in a spreadsheet? And if there is, how many formulas are there?
So yes, there is a way to expose your formulas. Another thing you can do with formulas is you can, well, it's pretty easy, I guess, right here. Let me go back. I'll bring one up. This one. There we go. Okay, so if I go to the formulas bar, I can click on show formulas, and it's going to do its best to expose all the formulas in the spreadsheet. It's going to make your view a little different, you know, and so that's what's going to show all the exposed formulas at once. And that can be handy because especially if it's not a document you are working on and you're trying to figure out, I don't want to mess up any of their formulas. I mean, be careful with that, by the way. That show formulas on the formula auditing grouping on the formulas tab. And then also another really nice thing to do is trace dependence or trace precedence. And that's good for error checking. If I had a situation set up, well, I'll kind of show you here, but you can click on a cell and it will tell you where that cell goes to. Let's see if I can do, there we go. So this cell is dependent in this formula and it points things and it kind of gives you a flow chart of where things go. Sometimes that can be really handy because what I find I do a lot in more advanced Excel spreadsheets is I'm tracing where the error is. Maybe it's a division by 0 error that happened 5 references ago. And so these are kind of the forensic tools you can use for error checking, evaluating a formula, tracing dependencies, that sort of thing. But the simplest of all those is the show formula because it allows you to see which cells have formulas and which cells are being referenced within that. All right, I know we need to get to the poll. So go ahead, Glory. And by the way, I did put in some bonus material here about removing blank rows. That's a very common question, so there is information on that, but I'll let you look at that at your own leisure. It's got the step-by-step on how to do that. So the poll question is, what I'd like to know is what version of Excel do you currently have? Now, if you don't have Excel at all, that's fine. Or if you use LibreOffice or something or Google Sheets, you can use different sheet. If you're not using any, put none. I do get some people don't even know. They just use Excel. That's fine too. Just use your best guess. But if you could take just a second to choose whatever version you are currently using the most. I think I have every version of Excel on that's ever been, but I use mostly 2013. If you could just do that, that would be great. While you're doing that, I'm going to go through something we go through at every single one of these Microsoft Office classes, and that is to give you the training resources I promised. If you just go to Google and type in whatever version of Excel you currently are working with, what a relevant question to our poll. The first result is going to be some really, really good training on everything we talked about today. Everything I talked about today will be within this training. be expanded on. There'll be videos. There'll be sample files to work with. The stuff that we worked with today was generally within formulas and functions, so it's lessons 13 through 16. But we did delve into some other ones too, so they're have nice topic headings on them also. And then once you're done with that, you can certainly go to test your skills at the North Star Digital Literacy testing site. You'll be happy to know that you've just surpassed most of what is required to pass that particular test. That's why we call this the advanced test, is that it doesn't require a lot of what they test on right here. These are more basic and intermediate skills. And then even though this is a sample of a Word certificate, it'll tell you if you passed and what you need to work on. All right, that's a lot. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. We have 3 minutes left. Glory, I'd be happy to take anything that came through. She may be looking at the polling results.
Yes, sorry about that.
All right.
We're getting an awful lot of thank yous, Art, but I wanted to, one of people asked, why do you use Excel 2013?
That's a great question. You know, I have 2019. Why am I using 2013? It doesn't matter. I use whatever's most convenient, and what's most convenient is my work computer, because that is what is paid for by the state of Minnesota. It costs an employer an enormous amount of money to re-up on licensures. It's not as simple as buying one licensure. They've got to buy for everybody, and they have to, you know, reinstall them to all their machines. There's a different type of licensure for mass installs like this, and that's why, you know, there are still some companies that use Windows 2007. I just got upgraded to 2010 not long ago. So we hold on to what's relevant as long as we can to save money. And as a taxpayer in the state of Minnesota, I appreciate that. At some point, we do have to jump on to the next thing, but not until it's relevant. And I will tell you, in 2010, they made a huge leap. They started in 2007, but in 2010, they made a huge leap in what was available in Excel. 99% of what you're going to use in 2019 can be found in every single one of those versions up to 2010. All right, at that point, I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you all so much. I don't know if you realize this, I love talking about Excel. It's my favorite program of all time. I get a real joy of having time to talk about it and answer your questions. There's so much information out there, folks. I hope you take advantage of that GCF. Just do a Google search, watch some YouTube videos. There's a whole world there waiting in Excel once you get past the scare factor. Because I get it. I was scared to death of it when I first got onto it. Once I found out what it could do for me, I've been using it every day since that time. Thank you, Glory, and thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.